Ever since Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, it has been essentially taboo, prohibited, to question either the nobility and justness of what the Ukrainians are doing in fighting the Russians, to question the US NATO narrative about that war, about why it happened, what the causes were. But especially it has been taboo to question President Zelensky and Joe Biden's policy of funding the war in Ukraine seemingly without end. Everyone who did that was called a Russian agent. You know all the terms that people get called when they challenge bipartisan war consensus in the United States. And yet, starting about a month ago, all of that began to rapidly unravel. Some of President Zelensky's most important allies went to Time magazine to depict Zelensky as this megalomaniac who is completely delusional, and to say everybody in Kiev understands that this war cannot be won. The goals of the war that the United States and NATO and Kiev said were the only ones that were acceptable, namely fighting the war until every Russian troop is expelled from every part of Ukrainian soil, including Crimea, is basically impossible. There's no way that will ever happen. Ukraine is not only running out of ammunition, it is running out of men to continue to fight this war. At the very beginning of the war, Zelensky called on, pled with a lot of men in the West who were saying they support this cause to please come and help us fight. Don't just sit on social media cheering this war. Come to Ukraine, help us fight the Russian army. And almost nobody did. And as a result, Ukraine has very few people left to send as cannon fodder to the front line. And many of the few who are left are trying to flee Ukraine, knowing what their fate will be if they go to that front line. So it's a very grim picture. And not only that, but Zelensky has canceled the election, said that there will be no new election until the war is over, which technically may be for a very long time. And they're starting now to denounce him as an authoritarian. He has shut down opposition media outlets and banned political parties. This great democracy for which we were told we were fighting. And now we're at the point where the US Congress is obviously unwilling to continue to fund this war. Here from the New York Times on December 6th, just this week, Republicans block aid to Ukraine, jeopardizing its fight against Russia. Quote, the vote spotlighted waning support in Congress for backing Ukraine in the war and left the fate of the effort uncertain. Maybe we can put the article on the screen as well. So what I want to say here is that this vote in Congress has followed what public opinion polls have showed for quite some time, which is that the American public long ago turned against this war. Majorities don't want to keep funding this war. Quote, the failed vote highlighted waning support in the United States for continuing to fund Ukraine's war effort at a perilous time in the conflict, with Kiev's counteroffensive failing to meet its objectives and Russian forces on the offensive. Now, you probably remember back in May and June, when it was clear that nothing was happening in this war, we were sending billions of dollars, people were dying, and the front line wasn't moving. We were told, oh, don't worry, there's a counteroffensive coming that's going to change everything. Max Boot wrote a Washington Post article featuring David Petraeus, who said he had just gotten back from Ukraine. Morale was higher than ever. The counteroffensive was almost certain to succeed. The counteroffensive was a massacre. It was a complete disaster. They lost so many people who don't want to be fighting, who are there as conscripts. All those tanks that the Germans sent, that the United States paid for, were destroyed. And they didn't breach any of those Russian lines, let alone to the extent that they said they needed to in order to transform the war. It was a complete disaster. Everything you were told about the counteroffensive was false, as usual. Quote, while the bill faltered over an unrelated immigration dispute, the resistance it has met in Congress reflects dwindling appetite among Republicans for backing Ukraine, as polls show that Americans are losing interest in providing financial assistance. Now, this unrelated immigration matter that the New York Times cryptically refers to was, in fact, a position that the House Republicans took under Speaker Mike Johnson, where they said, look, we'll fund this war in Ukraine only if you not only fund border security in the United States, but then every time you want another $5 billion sent from this authorization, you have to demonstrate that you've either sent people back or prevented people from coming in. Show a 15 or 20% decrease. In other words, you want us to pay for Ukrainian border security, but don't want to pay for border security at home in the United States. That's the position. And the Biden administration thus far has been unable to make the commitments it needs in order to get that $60 billion additional dollars. But the people of the United States are finally asking, and actually they've been asking for quite a while, why does my life and the happiness and prosperity of my life depend on dictating who runs these provinces in eastern Ukraine? How does this have anything to do with my life? Why am I going to keep working and paying taxes only to send it to Raytheon and General Dynamics and Boeing and enriching them so they can provide Ukraine with weapons? Why is this in my interest at all? And it was clear it was only a question of time from the start before Americans started asking that question. Quote, Republicans held ranks against the $111 billion bill, which would provide about $50 billion in security assistance to Ukraine, more for economic and humanitarian aid, and another $14 billion toward arming Israel in its war against Hamas. I want to make an observation about the Republican debate I talked about last night. There's something I noticed about Republican Party partisans. Whenever people on the stage, like Nikki Haley and Chris Christie, were mentioning fighting wars and being tough and sending missiles and bombs, they would all applaud like trained seals. They want to keep building up the military and paying for bombs and arming Israel and arming Ukraine and funding all these people's wars. And then they also want big corporate tax cuts. That's one of the things President Trump ushered in, big corporate tax cuts. And then at the same time, whenever Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis would talk about how terrible it is that the United States is suffering under trillions of dollars in debt, they would also applaud that as though they were somehow, these people, eager for the debt to go away. Please tell me, if you're going to go around the world fighting constant wars and funding other countries' wars like we're now doing in Ukraine and Israel, and we're going to build up this massive massive military that we're going to use to threaten Iran and bomb it if they don't behave better, and we're going to go confront China over Taiwan, and we're going to have bases all over the world, and at the same time you're cutting taxes for corporations, so you're massively reducing revenue while you're spending, we're almost spending $1 trillion a year now on our military, $1 trillion a year. How are you going to reduce the debt, the national debt? The reason we're borrowing so much money is because we keep funding all these wars. And the only way you can afford to fund wars like this if you then increase revenue, which is taxes. But the Republican Party can't because they're beholden to their corporate donors. So they're cheering for things that are completely inconsistent. There's no way to have an empire, to run the world as an empire, to constantly fund the boards of other countries without borrowing hundreds of billions of dollars and then trillions of dollars from China. It's not going to happen. Quote, Kiev will run out of resources to defend against Russia's invading army by the end of the year. So they're trying to do this scaremongering that if you don't fund this war in Ukraine, they're going to lose to Russia. They're already losing to Russia, even with all that aid we've been sending. The Russians control a fifth of Ukraine practically. They're never leaving Crimea. And they're never going to leave these provinces in eastern Ukraine either. It's not going to happen. This is just pouring money into the deep pockets of the people who run Washington. That's all this war is for, while people continue to die in huge numbers. And you have like sociopaths like Bill Kristol and Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham saying, oh, this is the best war we've ever fought. We're just sending tons of money, but we're not dying. We're letting the Ukrainians die, while their country is destroyed and they have no chance of expelling the Russians except at the diplomatic table. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.